My brother Richard slammed a heavy menu board on my daughter's head at his own party, laughing as she cried out in pain. He thought it was a harmless joke from the new family kingpin. So, I used the one skill he always belittled and set a trap he never saw coming. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The noise of the restaurant was a symphony of success. Clinking glasses, bursts of laughter, and the low hum of self-congratulation filled the private dining room my brother, Richard, had booked for his promotion party. I sat at a long table, nursing a glass of sparkling water, a small smile fixed on my face. My daughter, Clara, sat beside me, looking slightly overwhelmed but trying her best to be supportive of her uncle. At 16, a stuffy corporate dinner was hardly her idea of a good time, but she had put on her favorite dress and a brave face for me. For family. Richard was holding court at the head of the table, his voice booming over the others. He'd always been loud, but success had turned up the volume. His promotion to vice president at his investment firm had been the talk of the family for weeks, a milestone he wore like a crown. He was retelling a story about a rival he'd outmaneuvered, his gestures growing wider and more theatrical with every sentence. I watched him, a familiar mix of pride and unease swirling within me. He was my little brother, the one I'd helped with his homework and defended on the playground. Now, he was a man I barely recognized, his ambition having seemingly chiseled away the softer parts of his personality. Clara leaned over and whispered, "Mom, how much longer do we have to stay? Uncle Richard is getting really loud." "Just a little longer, sweetie," I whispered back, squeezing her hand under the table. "It's a big night for him, we just need to show our support." Clara sighed but nodded, her loyalty to family as ingrained as my own. That loyalty was the bedrock of my world. It was why I was here, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that Richard's success had come at a cost. The main courses were cleared and dessert menus were distributed. They were beautiful, heavy things, bound in dark leather with thick, embossed cardstock inside. Richard, flushed with wine and adulation, picked one up. "To the future!" he roared, holding the menu aloft like a trophy. His colleagues cheered. Then his eyes landed on Clara. A strange, mischievous glint appeared in them. "And to the next generation. Got to toughen them up for the real world, right?" Before I could process what he meant, he swung the heavy menu in a wide arc. It happened in slow motion. I saw the corner of the leather-bound board connect with Clara's temple. There was a sickening thud, a sound that cut through the celebratory din like a gunshot. Clara cried out, a sharp yelp of pain and surprise, her hands flying to her head. The menu clattered onto the table. For a second, the entire room fell silent. Every eye was on my daughter, who was now blinking back tears, her face pale with shock. Richard just laughed. It wasn't a nervous chuckle or an apologetic laugh. It was a deep, hearty, dismissive roar, as if he had just performed the most hilarious party trick. "See? Toughening her up," he boomed, clapping a colleague on the back. "She's fine. Kids are resilient." A few people offered weak, uncomfortable smiles, their eyes darting away. No one stepped in. No one said a word. They were all in Richard's orbit, caught in the gravitational pull of his new power, and none of them dared to challenge their son. I was frozen for a heartbeat, the scene before me so surreal I couldn't comprehend it. Then, the ice in my veins shattered, replaced by a volcanic surge of fury. I shot to my feet, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Richard!" My voice was low, trembling with a rage I had never felt before. He waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, relax, Emilia, it was a joke, don't be so sensitive." I ignored him, my focus entirely on my daughter. I gently pulled her hands away from her head, my own trembling. A red, angry welt was already rising on her delicate skin. Her eyes were wide, swimming with tears of not just pain, but humiliation. She was looking at her uncle, the man who was supposed to protect her, with an expression of utter betrayal. "We're leaving," I said, my voice dangerously calm. I helped Clara to her feet, my arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. She was shaking. As we walked towards the door, Richard's voice followed us, laced with irritation. Seriously, Emilia, you're going to ruin my party over a little tap on the head? I pay for this whole extravagant night, and this is the thanks I get. I stopped at the door and turned to face him. I looked at his smug, uncomprehending face, at T. His circle of silent sycophants surrounding him, and at the grand room that felt like a cage. In that moment, the brother I knew was gone. In his place stood a stranger, a cruel, arrogant man who had just assaulted my child and felt nothing. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow, worse than the one my daughter had just received. The betrayal was worse than any diagnosis, any financial loss, any hardship I had ever faced. The drive home was silent. Clara sat huddled in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her hand still pressed gently against the now-swelling bruise on her temple. The celebratory music on the radio felt like a cruel joke, and I quickly shut it off, leaving us in the heavy quiet of the car and our own thoughts. I kept glancing over at her, my heart fracturing a little more each time I saw the tear track glistening on her cheek in the passing streetlights. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the casual cruelty of the act, the public humiliation, and the complete lack of care from a man she had always looked up to. My rage from the restaurant had cooled into something harder and colder, a diamond-sharp resolve. When we got home, I immediately grabbed an ice pack from the freezer and gently pressed it against her head while she sat on the kitchen counter. She finally looked at me, her young eyes filled with a question she couldn't seem to voice. "It wasn't your fault, sweetie," I said softly, stroking her hair. "It was not a joke, and it was not okay. What he did was wrong." She nodded, leaning into my touch. "Why would he do that, Mom?" He laughed. The word came out as a whisper, full of hurt and confusion. It was the laughter that had broken something inside her, and inside me. It was the proof that the act wasn't an accident but a demonstration of power. My phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with Richard's name. A part of me wanted to hurl it against the wall, but another, more calculating part took over. I needed to hear what he had to say. I needed to know the depth of the rot. I answered, putting the phone on speaker. "What took you so long to answer?" Richard's voice was slurred, still thick with the arrogance of the party. There was no apology in his tone, only annoyance. "I was taking care of my daughter," I said, my voice clipped and cold. "The one you hit in the head." He scoffed. "Oh my God, Emilia, are you still on about that? I barely touched her. You're being hysterical. You embarrassed me in front of my entire team. Do you have any idea how that looked?" I was staggered by the audacity of his self-pity. How it looked? "Richard, you assaulted a child. You assaulted your niece. I don't care how it looked. I care that you hurt her and you felt no remorse." "Remorse for what? A little family roughhousing? You're so dramatic, you've always been. That's why you're stuck in that boring accounting job, counting beans, while I'm out here making real moves." His words were meant to sting, to put me back in the box he had created for me. The sensible, cautious, and ultimately unremarkable older sister. Clara flinched at his words, and I wrapped my arm tighter around her. "My boring job is not the issue here, Richard," I said, my voice dangerously steady. "The issue is your behavior." "Whatever," he slurred, his patience clearly gone. "Look, I don't have time for this. Just tell Clara to stop being a baby. I'm the vice president now. People need to show some respect. You should be proud of me, not causing a scene." He hung up. The line went dead, leaving a silence in the kitchen that was more damning than any of his words. He had not only failed to apologize, but he had doubled down, framing himself as the victim and me as the hysterical woman ruining his triumph. He saw my daughter's pain as an inconvenience to his celebration. I looked down at the phone, then at my daughter's bruised face. I thought about the years I had supported him, the tuition I helped pay for when our parents couldn't, the encouragement I offered when his confidence faltered. I had been his biggest cheerleader, and this was my reward, his contempt. He had called me a bean counter. For years, he dismissed my career as a forensic accountant as something tedious and small, a world of spreadsheets and receipts that he couldn't possibly understand. He saw me as a quiet, meticulous woman who lived by the rules, a stark contrast to his own self-styled image as a risk-taker, a titan of finance who bent the world to his will. He thought my skills were insignificant, a party trick for finding rounding errors. He believed my world was small. But he had forgotten one crucial thing. He had forgotten what I do for a living. I don't just count beans, I find out where they've been buried. Growing up, Richard was the sun, and I was the planet that quietly orbited him. He was charming, impulsive, and had a smile that could talk our parents out of any punish. Meant I was the responsible one, the quiet observer, the one who made sure his homework was done and his grand, reckless plans didn't end in complete disaster. When he wanted to go to a prestigious business school that was far beyond our parents' means, I was the one who took on a second job, tutoring college kids in accounting to help cover his expenses. I packed his lunches with encouraging notes, edited his essays, and told him he could achieve anything. I believed it. I poured my energy into his success because I loved him, and because his dreams were so much bigger and brighter than my own quiet ambitions. My dream was simpler. I wanted stability. I found a strange beauty in numbers, in the way they told a story of order and chaos, of integrity and deceit. I became a forensic accountant, a specialized field that most people, including my brother, found profoundly dull. "So you're like a math detective?" He'd once joked at a family dinner, to the amusement of everyone else. "You hunt for missing pennies." He never understood the gravity of it. He didn't understand that my job wasn't about pennies, it was about patterns. It was about finding the one thread that, when pulled, could unravel a massive, intricate tapestry of lies. I found satisfaction in restoring order, in holding people accountable for the stories their numbers told. Richard's rise in the corporate world was meteoric. He was a shark in a suit, aggressive and relentless. He talked about creative financing and aggressive growth strategies, terms that always made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He bought a flashy car, a penthouse apartment, and wore watches that cost more than my mortgage payments. With every promotion, he grew more distant, his gratitude for my past sacrifices curdling into a kind of condescending pity. He saw me as the sister who had failed to launch, the one who played it safe while he conquered the world. The man who assaulted my daughter was not an aberration. He was the final product of years of unchecked ambition and entitlement. The antagonist in my story wasn't just my brother anymore. It was the persona he had so carefully constructed. His name was Richard, but his title was vice president, and that title was everything. He had a new family now, the board members, the yes men, the junior associates who laughed at his terrible jokes. They were the ones who mattered, not the sister who still remembered him as a boy with scraped knees and a fear of the dark. I remembered the last time I'd felt a true prickle of suspicion. It was about a year ago at a family barbecue. Richard was boasting about a huge deal he had just closed, one that had apparently saved his company's quarter from disaster. He was vague on the details, waving his hand and saying it was high-level stuff I wouldn't understand. But he mentioned a shell corporation based in a country known for its lax financial regulations. It was a throwaway comment, meant to impress everyone with his worldliness. To me, it was a bright red flag. It was a classic move, a page ripped straight from the fraudster's playbook. At the time, I dismissed it. He was my brother. I wanted to believe he was just puffing out his chest, exaggerating his own importance as usual. I chose to ignore the cold knot of dread in my stomach. I chose family over fact. Now, sitting in my quiet home office in the dead of night, with the image of Clara's bruised face burned into my mind, I realized that my loyalty had been a leash. It had held me back from seeing the truth that was likely hiding in plain sight. Richard wasn't just arrogant, he was reckless. And reckless men, especially those who suddenly become very successful, often leave a trail. His polished appearance, his carefully curated stories of success, his vague explanations about his work, it was all a performance. The antagonist was the man who believed he was untouchable, who thought the rules didn't apply to him, and who saw his own family as props in the grand theater of his life. He had made a critical error. He assumed the quiet, boring bean counter in the audience wasn't paying attention. He had forgot that I was the one person in the world who knew how to read his financial story, and I was about to turn to the very last page. The morning after the party was cold and gray, mirroring the landscape of my emotions. The initial inferno of rage had burned down to embers of cold, hard purpose. While Clara slept in, exhausted from the emotional and physical toll of the night, I sat in my home office, the glow of my monitor pushing back the gloom. My decision had been made in the sleepless hours of the night. Richard had refused to be accountable for his actions, so I would hold him accountable for everything else. This was no longer just about a moment of violence. It was about the lifetime of arrogance that had led to it. My passive role as his supportive sister was over. I was now an active investigator. And my brother was my case. My first step was to map out what I knew. Richard worked for a publicly traded investment firm, Sterling Thorne. His promotion was to vice president of acquisitions. This meant he was responsible for identifying and purchasing smaller companies. It was a position of immense power, and for someone with a flexible moral compass, immense opportunity for misconduct. The key piece of leverage, the clever trap that I held, wasn't a document or a secret. It was my mind. It was my 2 decades of experience in untangling the most complex financial knots. He saw it as a weakness. I was about to prove it was a weapon. I started where all financial investigations begin, the public record. I spent hours poring over Sterling Thorne's quarterly and annual reports, their SEC filings, and press releases announcing recent acquisitions. It was dry, dense material, but to me, it was a language I spoke fluently. I was looking for anomalies, for numbers that didn't quite add up, for the subtle footprints of fraud. His big promotion, I discovered, was tied directly to a single, massive acquisition he had supposedly spearheaded 3 months prior. A tech startup called Innovate Dynamics. The deal was lauded in the financial press as a brilliant move, positioning Sterling Thorne to dominate a new market. Richard was painted as a visionary. But something felt off. The price paid for Innovate Dynamics seemed inflated, wildly so, for a company with a relatively small market share and no proprietary patents listed in the filings. Why would a shrewd firm like Sterling Thorne overpay by such a significant margin? This was the thread. Now I had to pull it. I used my professional subscriptions to access databases that are not available to the public, tools that allow me to dig into corporate ownership structures and executive histories. I started investigating Innovate Dynamics. On the surface, it looked legitimate. It had a website, a list of executives, and a physical address. But as I dug deeper, the facade began to crack. The company had been incorporated only 18 months earlier. Its CEO, a man named Marcus Thorne, had a suspiciously thin digital footprint for a tech mogul. The name Thorne snagged my attention. It was the same as the co-founder of Richard's firm, a legendary but now retired financier. A coincidence? Possibly. In my line of work, I don't believe in coincidences. I needed professional help to go further, someone who could get information I couldn't legally access from my desk. I called a man I knew, a private investigator named David Chen. He was a discreet and thorough former federal agent whom I'd worked with on a few complex corporate fraud cases. "Emilia," he said, his voice calm and professional. "It's been a while. I trust you're not calling to discuss the weather." "David, I have a personal matter," I said, keeping my voice even. "I need a deep background check on a man named Marcus Thorne and the ownership structure of his company, Innovate Dynamics. I also need to know if he has any connection, personal or professional, to my brother, Richard Miller." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Family?" David asked gently. "Yes," I replied, the word tasting like ash. "It's family." "I'll be discreet," he promised. "I'll have something for you in 48 hours. Hiring David was my point of no return. I was no longer just a concerned sister. I was actively building a case. The adrenaline that began to pump through my veins was familiar. It was the thrill of the hunt, the feeling of closing in on a truth that someone had tried very hard to bury. Richard had built his empire on a foundation of arrogance, assuming no one was smart enough or brave enough to look too closely. He had forgotten that I had spent my entire career looking for cracks in foundations just like his. David was better than his word. He called me back in 36 hours. "You were right to be suspicious, Emilia," he said, his tone grim. "This isn't just a red flag, it's a whole parade." The information he'd uncovered was damning. Marcus Thorne, the supposed CEO of Innovate Dynamics, was not a tech genius. He was a disgraced real estate developer who had declared bankruptcy twice. More importantly, he was a college friend of Richard S., a very close friend. David's digging revealed that Innovate Dynamics was little more than a shell company. It had a handful of low-level employees and almost no actual business operations. It was a ghost, created for the sole purpose of being acquired. The most explosive piece of information was in the company's ownership records. Marcus Thorne was the public face, but the primary beneficiary of the sale, hidden behind 2 layers of offshore accounts, was a trust. A trust established in the name of Richard's wife. My brother had used his firm's money to buy a worthless company from his best friend, channeling millions of dollars into his own family. Wise pockets. He hadn't just orchestrated a deal, he had orchestrated a heist. His grand promotion wasn't earned, it was stolen. I sat with this information for a full hour, the printed report from David spread across my desk. The sheer audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. It was a high-stakes gamble built on the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough. He had used his position of trust to defraud his own company, the very people who were celebrating him as their new star. The time for quiet investigation was over. It was time for the first confrontation. I needed to see his face, to gauge his reaction, to watch him squirm on the hook I was about to set. I didn't call him. Instead, I drove to his office building during his lunch hour, knowing he often ate at the upscale cafe in the lobby. I found him there, holding court at a small table with 2 younger associates who were hanging on his every word. He looked powerful and relaxed in his perfectly tailored suit. He didn't see me until I was standing right beside his table. "Emilia," he said, his smile tightening. The surprise on his face was satisfying. "What are you doing here? Is something wrong?" The way he asked made it clear he hoped nothing was wrong that might inconvenience him. "Richard, I need a word with you," I said, my voice calm and even. I glanced at his associates. "In private." He looked annoyed, but the steel in my voice must have told him this wasn't a request he could brush off. He excused himself, leading me to a secluded corner of the lobby. "This better be important," he hissed, dropping the facade of the magnanimous boss. "I'm in the middle of something." "Oh, it's important," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "I was doing a little light reading on your firm's recent acquisitions. It's a hobby of mine, you know, bean counting." I let the word hang in the air between us. "And I came across Innovate Dynamics. Fascinating company. I was just wondering, did you know the CEO, Marcus Thorne, went to college with you?" The blood drained from Richard's face. It was a subtle shift, but I saw it. The slight widening of his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. He had been expecting a tearful, emotional sister. He was not prepared for a forensic accountant. "That's a coincidence," he said, his voice a little too casual. "It's a small world." "Isn't it?" I continued, my voice still light. "Almost as small as the world of offshore banking. I find it so interesting how money moves around these days. It's like a magic trick." His composure began to crack. "What are you talking about? What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Richard," I said, taking a small step closer. "I'm just a boring accountant asking a question. You bought a company for over $100 million. I'm just curious about the due diligence. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you bought a ghost. And I have to wonder who got paid." He stared at me, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and panic. He was a cornered animal. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he snarled, his voice a low whisper. "You're out of your depth, Emilia. You need to go home and stop playing detective before you get yourself into serious trouble." His reaction was the final confirmation I needed. The poorly executed threat, the desperate attempt to intimidate me, it was the classic response of a guilty man. He wasn't just arrogant, he was a common criminal dressed in a $1,000 suit. "I'm not playing, Richard," I said softly, my point made, "and I think you're the one who is in serious trouble." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his carefully constructed world beginning to tremble. The first thread had been pulled, and he knew, with sickening certainty, that I was now holding the entire tapestry in my hands. Richard's panic manifested as aggression. The next 2 days were a barrage of escalating threats. First came the phone calls, his voice a venomous whisper, warning me to back off and forget whatever you think you know. When I didn't answer, the texts started, a mix of insults about my career and veiled threats about what would happen if I didn't stop my insane crusade. He tried to paint me as an unhinged, jealous sister trying to tear down his success. It was a desperate, clumsy attempt to regain control, but it only strengthened my resolve. He was acting like a common bully because he had been caught. While he was flailing, I was working. I took the file David had given me and began to build my case, transforming his raw data into an irrefutable narrative of fraud. I cross-referenced bank transfers with incorporation dates and shareholder reports. I created a flowchart that showed exactly how the money had moved from Sterling Thorne, through the ghost company Innovate Dynamics, and into the offshore trust controlled by his wife. The picture it painted was not just of corporate malfeasance, but of a calculated, long-term conspiracy. He had likely been planning this for years. The investigation uncovered an even more shocking layer of his deception. Innovate Dynamics wasn't his first scheme. I found 2 smaller, similar acquisitions over the past 3 years, both involving companies owned by other old friends of his. They were smaller amounts, test runs to see what he could get away with. He had been systematically bleeding his company dry, using his position to enrich himself and his circle. His entire career, the foundation of his identity, was a house of cards built on theft. The most difficult part of this was our parents. Richard, in his desperation, had called them and fed them a story about how I was having some sort of breakdown, consumed by jealousy over his promotion. My mother called me, her voice trembling with confusion and worry. "Emilia, what is going on? Richard said you're making wild accusations. He's worried about you." My heart ached. This was the part I had been dreading, the collateral damage to our family, but I couldn't back down. "Mom, what Richard did to Clara was just the tip of the iceberg," I told her, my voice heavy. "He is not the man you think he is." It was time for the next confrontation, but this one wouldn't be with Richard. It would be with our parents. I asked them to come to my house, telling them it was urgent. They arrived looking anxious, sitting stiffly on my living room sofa. Richard was there too. I had known he would come, that he wouldn't let me speak to them alone. He stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, radiating smug defiance. He thought he could control the narrative. "I'm glad you're here, Richard," I said calmly. "It saves me a trip." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get emotional. I simply opened a folder on my coffee table and began. "This isn't about jealousy," I started, looking directly at my parents. "This is about facts." For the next 20 minutes, I walked them through it. I showed them the incorporation documents for Innovate Dynamics. I showed them the bank records David had uncovered. I showed them the timeline that linked Richard's promotion directly to the fraudulent acquisition. I presented it not as a sister making accusations, but as a forensic accountant presenting a case. The numbers didn't lie. My parents stared at the documents, their faces a mixture of confusion and horror. My father, a man of quiet integrity, looked at the papers and then at his son, his expression slowly hardening. Richard tried to bluster his way through it. "This is ridiculous. It's all circumstantial nonsense she's cooked up in her sad little office. You can't possibly believe this." "Then explain this, Richard," I said, sliding one final document across the table. It was a copy of the signature card for the offshore trust, the one that had received the millions. On the line for the trustee was a name they both recognized, his wife. That was the irrefutable proof. The spell was broken. My mother let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. My father slowly stood up and looked at his son, his face etched with a disappointment so profound it was terrifying. "Is this true, Richard?" my father asked, his voice barely a whisper. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the pale, clammy fear of a man who had been completely and utterly exposed. He stared at me, his eyes filled with a hatred so pure it was chilling. In that moment, he didn't see a sister. He saw the architect of his ruin. The perfect setting for Richard's downfall was a place of his own choosing. 2 weeks after our disastrous family meeting, Sterling Thorne was hosting its annual charity gala, a glittering affair designed to showcase the firm's philanthropy and success. Richard, as the newly minted vice president, was scheduled to give a keynote address. It was meant to be his coronation, the moment he was officially presented to the city's financial elite as the future of the company. He had even, in a final act of hubris, sent an invitation to my parents and me. A pathetic attempt to project an image of family unity and prove that my silly accusations had blown over. I, of course, accepted. I spent the 2 weeks leading up to the gala preparing. I compiled my findings into a concise, damning report, complete with exhibits and a clear, easy-to-follow narrative of the fraud. I sent one copy to the SEC. I sent another, through a trusted legal contact, to the chairman of the board at Sterling Thorne, a man named Arthur Sterling, the firm's aging but still sharp founder. I timed its delivery for the afternoon of the gala, ensuring the key players would have the information when the moment was right. I arrived at the gala with my parents. They were silent and grim, their presence a show of support for me, not for him. We found our table and watched as the grand ballroom filled with the city's most powerful piop. Richard was in his element, gliding through the crowd, shaking hands, his plastic smile firmly in place. But I could see the strain in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand as he lifted a glass of champagne. He knew I was there. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know what. After the dinner service, Arthur Sterling himself, a man in his late 70s with eyes that missed nothing, took the stage to introduce his new star. "It is with great pride," he began, "that I introduce a man who represents the bold future of this firm, our new vice president of acquisitions, Richard Miller." The room erupted in polite applause. Richard walked to the podium, basking in the glow of the spotlight. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and began his speech, a pre-written piece of fluff about integrity, vision, and shareholder value. He was 5 minutes into his address when 2 men in dark, conservative suits entered the ballroom from a side entrance. They spoke quietly to the event security, then to Arthur Sterling, who nodded grimly. As Richard was reaching the crescendo of his speech, the 2 men walked calmly and purposefully towards the stage. Richard saw them coming. His voice faltered, the words catching in his throat. The entire room, sensing the shift in atmosphere, fell silent. One of the men, a senior partner from the firm's legal counsel, stepped up next to the podium. He took the microphone from Richard's nerveless hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, please forgive this interruption," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "There has been a serious development. Sterling Thorne has received credible evidence of significant financial misconduct related to several recent acquisitions. As a result, Mr. Richard Miller has been suspended, effective immediately, pending a full internal and federal investigation." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Cameras flashed. Whispers turned into a roar. Richard stood there, frozen in the spotlight, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. He looked out into the crowd, his eyes searching frantically until they found mine. I simply met his gaze, my expression neutral. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The quiet, methodical work of the past weeks had done all the talking for me. Then Arthur Sterling himself walked onto the stage. He stood before Richard, not with anger, but with a cold, weary disappointment. "You betrayed the trust of this firm, of our clients, and of every person in this room," he said, his voice low but carrying in the stunned silence. "You are a disgrace." That was the final blow. The public humiliation was absolute. My brother, the self-proclaimed king, had been dethroned in front of the very audience he had sought to conquer. He was escorted off the stage, his face pale, his empire of lies collapsing around him in a matter of seconds. As he passed our table, he didn't even look at us. He was already a ghost. The fallout from the gala was swift and brutal. Richard's story was front-page news in the financial papers. Sterling Thorne VP fired in massive fraud scandal. The internal investigation, armed with the roadmap I had provided, quickly confirmed my findings. The federal investigation followed, and within months, Richard was facing a host of charges, including wire fraud and embezzlement. His ill-gotten fortune was frozen, his penthouse was seized, and the friends who had cheered him on at his party vanished overnight. His wife, facing her own legal troubles as a trustee, divorced him, taking what little was left. The brother I once knew, the man who had commanded rooms with his booming voice and confident smile, was reduced to a caricature of failure. I saw a picture of him once, walking into the courthouse for a hearing. He looked thin, tired, and utterly broken. There was no victory for me in that image, only a profound sense of sadness for the person he could have been and for the family he had shattered. My focus turned inward, toward healing. The most important reconciliation was with Clara. We spent hours talking, not just about what Richard had done, but about family, loyalty, and the difficult reality that sometimes the people we love disappoint us in the most profound ways. The bruise on her temple had long since faded, but the emotional scar took time to heal. I enrolled her in a self-defense class, not because I thought she would need to fight, but because I wanted her to feel strong and in control of her own body again. Slowly, her confidence returned, brighter and more resilient than before. My parents struggled, caught between their love for their son and the horrifying truth of his actions. It was my father who finally bridged the gap. He came to my house one evening, his eyes filled with a sorrow I had never seen before. "You were right, Emilia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did what you had to do. You protected your daughter. You stood for what was right. I am so proud of you." His words were a balm on a wound I didn't even realize was still open. Professionally, my life took an unexpected turn. My role in uncovering the Sterling Thorne fraud became a quiet legend in certain circles. I received a call from Arthur Sterling himself. He thanked me for my integrity and offered me a position leading a new, independent oversight division at his firm, a department tasked with ensuring that something like Richard's scheme could never happen again. I accepted. It felt right, using my skills not just to uncover deceit, but to build a system of accountability. Richard was eventually sentenced to several years in federal prison. He never reached out, never apologized. The bridge between us was burned to the ground. There is a part of me that will always mourn the brother I lost long before that fateful party, but the woman I became, the mother who fiercely protected her child and the professional who demanded justice, is not someone who looks back. My life is quiet again, filled not with the noise of corporate battles, but with the peaceful rhythm of work I believe in and the love of a daughter who knows, without a doubt, that her mother will always be in her corner. The books are balanced, the case is closed, and we are at peace.